For me, I include lots of things into the addiction bracket that I know not necessarily everybody would. For me, it started expressing itself when I was about 14, 15. I developed an eating disorder. And I mention that to say because I almost was addicted to the numbers, the weight loss. It wasn't even that, like, I didn't want to be skinny. Like, I was naturally very small, but it was this thing that I could quantify, that I could see it drop. And it gave me like some form of serotonin boost when it went down. And you know, this thing of my life for a long time was this game of emotional whack-a-mole, where, you know, I beat the eating disorder, and then I started self-harming, and then I'd stop self-harming, and then it was always this, like, if you imagine like a little toddler, it's always like grabby hands onto something that would just make me feel a little bit better. When you're in addiction, you are isolated. You're cutting yourself off from every relationship, to any meaningful communications with people, any connection whatsoever. And then it's like, oh, I wonder why I'm drinking myself to death, or using myself, or doing whatever to death. And it's like, because what else have you got going on?
As a matter of fact, when you look at the brain circuits involved in addiction, whether they have to do with any of these behaviors or with substances, it's exactly the same brain circuits that are involved. Shopping addicts get the same dopamine hit that the cocaine addicts get, except they get it through the shopping. So the shopping addict is a chemical addict, except the chemistry is internally generated through that particular behavior. Same with the gambler, same with the sex addict. Same with the workaholic. So that whether you're looking at biochemically or psychologically, addictions all fill the same role in people's lives. It's just that in the case of the substance addict, they have to get a substance. And then the question is why? Now, the societal answer to that question as to what addiction is all about is basically that it's a problem of choice. People just choose to do drugs. They choose to do drugs because they're ignorant, because they're ethically flawed, morally deficient, or stupid. But it's a choice they make. If you think that something is a conscious choice that somebody makes, then how are you going to stop them? Well, you're going to stop them by deterring them. How are you going to deter them? By means of punishments. So the Canadian government is dedicated to the draconian punishments of drug addicts. As you know, they've just introduced laws that make it much tougher on drug addicts now for growing 6 marijuana plants. Just as Uruguay is now bringing legislation to allow people to grow their own marijuana and to tax it and to market it. So Canada is making it increasingly punitive to possess drugs. And if apparently, according to new legislation, if you're a party and you pass somebody a marijuana joint, you can be accused of trafficking. And the mandatory sentences for drug possession are going up and up and up. Judges and prosecutors have less latitude now to plea bargain or to exercise clemency. The result of which, that in a society that has less and less money for social services, less and less money for culture, less and less money to protect the environment, we're spending billions of dollars on building more jails and keeping people in jail longer, all because we think that addiction is a matter of choice. Now, the other hypothesis when it comes to addictions is the more of the disease model. Addictions, this model would have it, is a disease of the brain. And as to when it comes to the causation of the disease, what we're looking at is genetic causes. So that alcoholism, drug addiction, and so are nicotine addiction, and so on. These are largely determined by genes. So this hypothesis would have it. Now, that addictions represent the disease of the brain is certainly valid. You can show that on brain scans and all kinds of biochemical assays. The addicted brain is a diseased brain. However, the assumption that this is genetic, and certainly that looking at it as a disease is more humane and offers at least the imperative of treating people, which the choice hypothesis does not. But what the choice hypothesis and the genetic hypothesis do have in common is a powerful ideological comfort. Because if something is a matter of individual choice on the one hand, or on the other hand, it's because of some gene that they inherited, then we don't have to look at social conditions. We don't have to look at the social conditions that engender addictive behaviors. We don't have to look at how children are treated. We don't have to look at what happens to pregnant women. We don't have to look at what happened in this country to the Aboriginal population, which has some of the world's highest rates of addiction. This is despite the fact that there were substances in North America that were potentially addictive before the coming of the Caucasians, such as tobacco, such as peyote, such as psychedelic mushrooms, such as other plants, such as alcoholic spirits in some areas of North America. But there was no history of addiction. If these problems were purely genetic or matters of choice, why wasn't there addiction before? And yet now, our First Nations population is dying at much higher rates than the rest of the population. They're incarcerated much more. And similarly, a society that celebrates individual enterprise and individual success at the expense of the others, it's dog-eat-dog kind of mentality. We can't be looking at people's social relationships and the necessary interconnection and the need for love. So that separation of mind-body and separation of environment, psychosocial environment, from the physiology of individuals is not a scientific perspective. It's an ideological one. It's an ideological perspective that completely ignores the science. That's the nature of ideology, is that it doesn't let the facts penetrate. It doesn't let the facts penetrate because the facts would threaten it only admits those facts that doesn't threaten the ideology. And those facts that would undermine or call into question the ideological perspectives are not, they don't come into the equation at all. They, in the words of Mr. Spock, they just don't compute. So there's a lot of realities in this world that in the minds of decision makers just don't compute. Now, if we look at addictions more closely, what do we see? Well, remember I talked about adaptations. As a medical doctor, I'm sure your training was similar to mine. For all its indubitable and miraculous attainments, misses the mark in some very essential areas. Because what it does, it separates some factors that cannot be separated in real life. It separates mind from the body, and it separates the individual from the environment. So when it comes to understanding cancer, for example, it's always looking for the cause of cancer either in some external toxin like cigarette smoke or in some genetic problem in the individual. But the idea that cancer may have something to do with a person's emotional life and stresses throughout a lifetime and their psychological and social relationships with the environment doesn't enter into the thinking of mainstream medicine. Which is really ironic because the pioneering and great medical teacher, Sir William Osler, in 1892, when he wrote his textbook of medicine, he said that rheumatoid arthritis, for example, is a nervous system disorder caused by worry and stress. And Osler also said that if I want to know whether or not a man will survive tuberculosis, I need to know not what's in his lungs, but what's in his head. Now, at the time, he had no research whatsoever. There was just no science to prove the truth of what he was saying. He was working purely on intuition and observation. Since his days, over 120 years ago now, his teachings have been fully validated by science, but medical practice, far from catching up with the science or even catching up with his pioneering insights, completely ignores that wisdom. And yet, for example, when it comes to HIV, a whole number of studies have shown that survival is affected not only by the quality of the treatment, which of course is important, and nobody can deny the miraculous advances made in the treatment of that condition in the last decade or more, but that still people's emotional stresses and their social connections have a lot to do with how well they do with the disease. So that you can't separate the emotions and the psychology from the physiological. That's the first point. The second point is that you can't separate the individual from the environment. Not when it comes to understanding anything. Not when it comes to understanding cancer. Not when it comes to understanding rheumatoid arthritis. Not when it comes to understanding HIV. Not when it comes to understanding childhood developmental disorders like ADHD and all the various diseases that kids are being diagnosed with left, right, and center, not when it comes to addiction, not when it comes to anything.
Environment is also an extremely important factor, and we know that. Stress facilitates drug taking and facilitates the transition into addiction. And obviously, because of social inequalities, certain ethnic groups may have greater social stress than others.
They actually argued, and they collated a lot of research, that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiological and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant long-term cost in terms of learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the things that children do to survive stress in the early years, not that they do them consciously, but the adaptations that they're forced to come to, those same adaptations that help them survive their childhoods actually make them sick later on. And the case I'm going to make for you today is that whether it comes to addictions, whether it comes to childhood disorders, mental health issues, or even physical illnesses like cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on, it's all based on childhood adaptation, and that the common theme, the common source of all human illness is actually a disturbance in people's attachment relationships. Now, attachment is the drive of a person to be close to another person. So it's the drive for proximity, the seeking of closeness for the purpose of being taken care of or for the purpose of taking care of somebody else. Biologically, instinctually, programmed to attach for the very simple reason that as infants, we're the most helpless, least mature, and stay that way longer than any other creature in the universe. So that we don't survive with that attachment, nor as a species would we have survived but for our social relationships. So quite contrary to the capitalist myth that people are individualistic, egotistical, competitive, and aggressive, we're just the opposite. We're actually social creatures wired for love, wired for closeness, wired for attachment. And when those attachment dynamics are disturbed, everything else follows. Now let me give you 3 examples of what I mean. And this perspective has been called the biopsychosocial perspective. Biopsychosocial means that the biology of human beings is inseparable from their psychological and social relationships. So, how do you explain certain things? Studies that show that if your parents are divorced, your risk of a stroke doubles 60 years later. A recent study, men sexually abused have tripled the rate of heart attacks as adults. Not to mention multiple the rate of suicide. Girls whose fathers are distant emotionally are going to menstruate earlier than girls whose fathers are close to them. Women followed over a 10-year period in the United States, 1,700 women, married women. Those that were unhappily married but didn't express their emotions in that 10-year period were 4 times as likely to die as those women who were also unhappily married but did express their emotions. So the difference wasn't unhappiness or happiness. The difference was, did you express who you were? Did you express your feelings? Or did you suppress them? It turned out that if a woman had a major stressful episode prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself did not increase the risk of the cancer, 0 effect. Similarly, if a woman was emotionally isolated, that by itself also did not increase the risk of the cancer, 0 effect. So far, so good. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and stressed, the risk of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. Now, the researchers, being medical scientists, had no way to explain this, because to the left brain, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? How does 0 and 0 multiply to 9? Now, can anybody here suggest the explanation? Very straightforward, physiologically. Any hazard a guess? What's the connection here? Well, okay, think about it. When you're stressed, it's not just this is not a psychological event. The research on stress, the research that showed for all the world what the physiological effects of stress are, was done at the University of Montreal by a Hungarian-born physician like I am. His name was Hans Selye. And he's the one that did the seminal work on stress. He nearly won a Nobel Prize for it. In fact, he's the one that coined the word stress. Stress is a Canadian word, did you know? He's the one that coined it in the way that we use it today. I mean, the word existed, but he's the one that adapted it to that particular usage. So when you're stressed, it's not just that you're upset or perturbed psychologically, it's that your body homeostasis, your body's internal biochemical balance shifts. What happens is that in response to emotional messages from the brain, for example, if I were to scare you right now by threatening you with a weapon, then those emotional triggers would send messages to a master gland in the brain called the hypothalamus, which would then affect another gland called the pituitary, which would then send messages to the rest of the body, including there'd be messages sent to the adrenal gland on top of your kidney, and then the adrenal gland would release these 2 hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And the job of adrenaline and cortisol are to help you fight or to escape, the flight or fight response. So they give you more energy, they elevate your sugar levels, heart rate, tense your muscles, prepare you to defend yourself. By the way, it's very interesting. In medical terms, we talk about what they call essential hypertension when it comes to high blood pressure. So that, there's some identifiable causes for blood pressure, such as kidney disease or other conditions, rare conditions. But most people with high blood pressure, we say, we don't know what causes it. That's only because we're not listening to ourselves. As I just said, in medical terms, we call high blood pressure hypertension. Think about it. Too much tension. Too much tension in people's lives. Too much adrenaline. That's what causes high blood pressure. Most of the time. And I know for myself, that I'm prone for high blood pressure. When I get very stressed, my blood pressure goes up. I don't take medications. I take my high blood pressure when it happens as a sign that I'm too stressed, and that I got to deal with the stress. And my blood pressure is usually, in a low range. But if I ignore my own advice and permit myself to get overstressed, it goes into very high levels. So, over a period of time, the cortisol also causes ulcerations in the intestines. Now, this is very interesting, because the one disease that used to be understood to be a stress-related disease even by Western medicine were ulcers. And then lo and behold, in the 1990s or late 1980s, we discover that there's a bacteria implicated in ulcers called Helicobacter pylori. And if you give antibiotics, you can cure the ulcer. Aha, doctors say, so much for the stress hypothesis, it's all the bacteria. Huh. Well, guess what? At age 40, 40% of the population has the bacteria in their stomachs. At age 50, 50% too. At age 60, 60% too. But do 60% of people have ulcers? If the bacteria cause the ulcer, why doesn't 60% have ulcers? Because it's the stress that makes them vulnerable for that bacterial damage.
There are a group of researchers at UCSF who found that there are these terminal ends of DNA called telomeres. They're like bookends. They stabilize that DNA. And what they found is that stress destabilizes that DNA. So just like inflammation is bad, a destabilized DNA strand is really bad. And what they found is that meditation can help help increase the enzyme that stabilizes that terminal end of the DNA. So super, super cool stuff with meditation. I'm not supposed to say that. I'm biased. I'm sorry. Okay, so for the last few minutes, what I'd like to do is, and I appreciate everybody taking notes, so that's awesome, but what I'd like you to do is ask you to just put everything to the side, and what I'd like people to do is to get comfortable, and we're going to just do a breathing meditation. And I'll start. And what you want to do is just take a nice deep breath in through your nose. 1, 2, 3, and then exhale through your mouth. 2, 3. And we're just going to repeat that. Just try another breath in. And if you're breathing faster, it's okay. Exhale. Blow it all out. Another breath in, and then exhale out. Now with this breath, I want you to feel the air coming through your nostrils into the back of the throat, and then exhale. Feel the warm air coming through your mouth as you exhale. On the next breath in, feel the air coming through the nostrils, down the back of your throat, and try to bring it down even further into your lungs, deep, deep, in, and then exhale. Blow it all out. With the next breath in, try to go to a count of 5. In, 1, 2, 3, 4, keep breathing. 5, and then exhale slow. 2, 3, 4, 5. Keep exhaling if you can. The next breath in, try to expand your belly, expand your abdomen with this breath. Don't expand your chest. Try to really just expand your abdomen. Just really let the abdomen expand and then shrink the abdomen. Just really bring your belly button as close as you can to your spine. You can even on the next breath put your hand on your belly and just feel your abdomen expand with that breath and then contract into the spine with the exhalation. Next breath, see if you can expand your hand even further and then contract. Bring your hand as close as you can in. It should make it all the way in, all the way. Keep blowing, keep blowing. And now I want you to draw your breath all the way down, expand your abdomen, and see if you can draw it even past the abdomen into your pelvic region. See if you can visualize your breath making it all the way down into your pelvis, all the way, all the way. Expand it, and then as you exhale, just drop your weight into your pelvis, and your abdomen just shrinks back towards your spine. Another breath in, and then with this exhalation, what I want you to try to do is drop your shoulders. So as you exhale, drop your shoulders, let your shoulders just go. Blow the tension out of your shoulders. Go back to that same breath. You can raise your shoulders on the in-breath if you want a little bit. And now as you exhale, drop your shoulders. Release, blow, 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 and drop your shoulders. Drop, drop, drop. Blow it out. Blow it out, blow it out. And now I want on the inhalation, same movements, but try to count to 8. Slow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Get the end of it. 7. Blow hard. 8. Hand all the way contracted. 9 and 10. Another breath in. And try that again. Expand your breath. Expand your breath. So a deeper, slower breath in, and then a deeper exhalation, slow exhalation out. And now with this next breath, see yourself draw a color in. Draw a color of breath. Pick a color, something that's full of energy and life. Pick a color and see that color as your breath. And then draw it all the way into the abdomen. So fill your nose with that color. Fill your chest with that color. Fill your abdomen with that color. And then as you exhale, exhale black. All the tension, exhale black. Now with this next breath, draw that same color that you've picked, draw it into you through the nose, through the chest wall, into the abdomen. Feel yourself full of that color, and then exhale. Blow the tension out. Blow it black. Blow all that tension out. And now on the next inhalation, try to draw that color all the way down into your feet. Draw it in through your nose, in through your chest wall, in through the abdomen, And try all the way down into the feet. Can you feel that? See that? See your toes glisten with your color, and as you exhale, there's only a little bit of tension now. Blow. At the end of the breath, you're going to see your color come out. You see it. Make yourself see your color of light come out. Blow, blow. See that color come out. Another big breath in. Fill yourself with that color as deep as you can go down into your feet. And then exhale. And for the next few breaths, we're going to draw the color in, expand the belly, and then with the exhalation, you're going to exhale because you're so full of your light color. You're going to exhale the same color and drop your shoulders. Release the tension. On this next breath, draw the color in, and as you exhale, release the tension now from the shoulders, from the lower back, and even from your feet. Release the tension. Uncurl your toes, let them relax and just drop. Drop to the ground, and you're blowing out your color. Another big breath in. Try to hold it for 8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then exhale for 10. Slow. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Keep blowing. 9, 10. Another color-filled breath in. And then exhale, slow out. And now I want you to start moving your fingers. Keep with your nice, slow breath. But start wiggling your fingers. Start wiggling your toes. And then with your next exhalation, go ahead and open your eyes. Come back to the room.
And that means for a long time, your body would be under siege from your own stress hormones. But what if you weren't emotionally isolated? What if a friend came along and said, and by the way, when I say this, think about the work that you're doing. Think about the importance of the work that you're doing on the physiological level. What if a friend came along, or somebody who cared, came along and said, well, I see that you're having a hard time. Do you want to talk about it? What would happen immediately to your body, to your physiology? Well, the first thing that happens is you take a deep breath. Yeah. And oxygen would go to your brain. You start thinking more clearly. And your blood pressure will go down. And your adrenaline levels would abate. And your cortisol levels would fall. And your body would come back to a normal physiological state. Then you'd be protected from the immune suppressant effects of the cortisol. No wonder then that the women who are isolated and stressed are 9 times as likely to have cancer, which also tells us that cancer is not an individual disease. Cancer reflects a lifetime relationship with the environment. And I could give you a whole talk about that, not just the physical environment. See, it's easy enough to say that smoking causes cancer, except we all know that smoking does not cause cancer, don't we? If smoking caused cancer, then everybody who smoked would have cancer. But most people who smoke don't have cancer, which doesn't mean that smoking doesn't contribute to cancer. Of course it does. It's a major risk factor. 95% of people with lung cancer are smokers. But it's not by itself the cause. When you actually look at the lives of people who get cancer, they're also people who suppress their emotions. And the more they suppress their emotions, the less smoke they need to trigger the cancer. So we have to stay away from this idea that single factors cause disease. So cancer doesn't just reflect, and by the way, why do people suppress their emotions? Well, that has to go back to their attachment relationships early in life. Because no 2-day-old baby ever suppressed their emotions. Nor have you ever met one. So the suppression of emotion is an adaptive response. Remember that article from Pediatrics? It's an adaptive response to an environment that can't handle your emotions as a child. Then you learn to suppress it as a way of adapting, as a way of surviving. But then that same adaptation becomes a cause of pathology later on. Think of depression. You think, well, there's nothing adaptive about depression. And in the brains of people who had been abused as kids, there were particular genetic changes that was caused by the abuse. And at University of British Columbia, within the last year, they showed that when they looked at the genetic functioning of teenagers, a whole number of genes had been affected in the teenager by stresses that the mother had in the child's first couple of years of life. And a bunch of other genes were affected by stresses on the father when he was a little bit older. In other words, when the primary relationship is just with the mother, then it's the mother's stresses that affects the genetic functioning of the child who later becomes a teenager whose genes are still affected by what happened to the mother in the first 3 years of life. And then later on, stresses on the father. So that genes don't, by themselves, explain very much, unless we recognize that genes are actually turned on and off by the environment. And that's what I mean, again, by this biopsychosocial understanding of human beings that is so foreign to the practice of medicine. So that's the second example, these women in Australia. The third example of what's been called the biopsychosocial approach is, if you look at a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, 3-4 years ago, elderly people who've been together for a long time, an elderly couple, when one is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens to the other one? They're much more likely to die. The physiology, their very immune system of the one is significantly influenced by the emotional relationship with the other. But all of a sudden, that emotional relationship is lost, death has a greater risk of occurring. And many of you have seen examples, I'm sure, that in couples who've been together for a long time, one of them dies, the other one succumbs very quickly afterwards. This is not universal, because it depends on the attachment relationship and how individuated that person is. If they rely totally on the relationship for their sense of self, the more susceptible they are. And that reliance on the relationship was an adaptation early in childhood. When you look at people's behaviors, when it comes to the spread of the HIV epidemic, I remember reading a book quite some years ago now. I think it was called When the Band Stood Still, by Randy Shills, was it? Yep. A journalist from the States who himself died of AIDS later on. And in the book, he describes he traces the rise of the HIV epidemic, and of course it was abetted in large measure by the incredible promiscuity of homosexual males on the West Coast and elsewhere. I mean, it was incredible. People would have sex across a hole in the wall with some total stranger. But that promiscuity is not a moral failure, nor is it a bad choice that people make. It's actually an adaptation, which is the same is true in heterosexual promiscuity. There's nothing about homosexuality that itself causes promiscuity, because basically, truly, I think we're monogamous by nature. The promiscuity is a desperation to be loved, a desperation to be found desirable, a desperation to be wanted. Where does that come from? In every case, it comes from your early relationship with parents. When you didn't have that sense of being wanted and loved and welcomed and accepted and being desirable. And very often these guys would have very bad relationship with their fathers. Then, of course, you will engage in behaviors that'll prove to you that you're desirable and lovable and wanted. So it's an adaptation. It's an adaptation that then becomes a source of pathology later on. So it's with that perspective then that I think we can understand almost all, and I know that sounds like a heck of a mouthful, but almost all human disease and psychological dysfunction. If we understand, number one, the importance of attachment, and number two, the desperate adaptations that people will have to make if their attachment needs are not met early in life. The number of stimulant prescriptions in Canada has gone up 43% in the last 5 years. When I wrote my book on ADHD 12 years ago, it had gone up, I think, fivefold in the previous 15 years. So it keeps going up and up and up and up and up. In the United States, 10% of children are now said to meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. In the States, there are 3 million kids at least who are getting stimulant medications, 500,000 children who are getting antipsychotic medications. Tens of thousands of kids in this country probably are getting antipsychotic medications as well. Antipsychotics like risperidone and Seroquel, such as we give to adult schizophrenics to control their psychosis. We're not giving it to kids to control their psychosis. Why are we giving it to them? To control what? To control their behaviors. What we've got now is a massive experiment in the chemical control of children's brains. We have no idea, because the research has not been done, of what are the long-term effects of antipsychotics on children's brains. We have no idea. What I do know is that in Children's Hospital in Vancouver, they've had to establish a clinic just to deal with the side effects of the antipsychotics, which include obesity, skin problems, cognitive problems, behavior problems, and so on. But we don't know what the long-term effects are because these are off-label uses. The number of children being diagnosed with autism has burgeoned. It's 30-fold in the last 40 years, or I always forget whether it's 30-fold in the last 40 or 30-fold or 40-fold in the last 30. It's something incredible. The number of kids being diagnosed with anxiety, bipolar illness, depression, conduct disorders, oppositional defiant disorder, going up and up and up and up. And if you ask most physicians what causes the problem, the official explanations for ADHD, for example, it's a genetic disease, which is inherent nonsense, because genes don't change in a population that quickly. Now, you could argue that it's not that the disease is going up, it's just that we're better at recognizing it. But that certainly doesn't seem to be the case. We're just seeing many more kids who are troubled. And anybody who's been in education for 30 years or psychology will tell you that.
The 8-year-old, identified only as SR, was 3.5 feet tall. He weighed 52 pounds when this video was shot by a school employee.
The second chapter of my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, opens at a funeral home. I won't read you much from the chapter, except this is of a patient who was 35. Her name is Shannon, and she, having stayed 6 months at a rehab home, or several months at least, something snapped. She came back to the downtown Eastside, and within a couple of months was found dead of an overdose. And after the funeral, we meet in a parking lot. I look at this small cluster of human beings gathered at the funeral of a comrade who met her death in her mid-30s. How powerful the addiction, I think, that not all the physical disease and pain and psychological torment can shake loose its lethal hold on their souls. Nothing sways them from their habit, not illness, not the sacrifice of all love and relationship, not the loss of all earthly goods, not the crushing of their dignity, not the fear of dying. The drive is that relentless. How to understand the death grip of drug addiction? What keeps Penny injecting after the spinal suppuration that nearly made her paraplegic? Why can't Beverly give up shooting cocaine despite the HIV, the recurring abscesses I've had to drain on her body, and the joint infections that repeatedly put her in hospital? What could have drawn Shannon back to the downtown Eastside and her suicidal habit and her 6 months getaway? How does she shrug off the deterrence of HIV and hepatitis, a crippling bone infection, and the chronic, burning, piercing pain of exposed nerve endings owing to an unhealing ulcer on her leg? It's kind of a wry expression. We say, oh, he's feeling no pain. Cocaine is a local anesthetic, still used that way. And in one way or another, all drugs are used to numb your feelings or to escape from emotional distress. And that means, by the way, as my mantra says, that the first question in addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And if you understand why people have pain, you can't look at their genes. You can't look at choices. You have to look at their lives, their actual life experiences. If we go deeper and we ask, why is it that these medication or these drugs even work? Well, why is it? Why is it that you take an opiate that grew in Afghanistan and you take it here in Canada, and it has such a powerful impact on your brain and your body? Well, of course, the answer is because we have receptors for the opiates. Now, receptors, as you know, are chemical binding sites on the surfaces of our cells. So each cell has tens of thousands of receptors for many different kinds of messenger substances. So if my head is a brain cell, then there might be a receptor that looks like this, thousands of these. There might be thousands of these, all these different configurations of receptors. And to each kind of receptor, a different chemical can bind. Now, by the way, Bruce Lipton, a molecular biologist, asked a brilliant question, which I totally flubbed when he asked me this. As a medical doctor, I totally flubbed it. Let me ask you this. Remember the picture in high school biology of the human cell? There's this sort of square with the membrane around it and the cytoplasm, this gelatinous material that fills up the space in the cell. In the center, there's the nucleus. Now, what if I ask you, what do you think is the brain of the cell? Or what would you say? What would anybody say? Nucleus. The nucleus, okay? And how many would agree that the nucleus is the brain of the cell? Just, okay, put your hand up if you agree. Who would say anything else? Any other opinions? Yeah? The outer layer, the membrane. And why do you say that? Say that again? You're totally right. I also said it was the nucleus, but actually it's the membrane. Because the part of our body, our brains have the job of receiving messages from the environment, telling the body what to do, and then taking the messages from the body and communicating them to the environment. That's done by the membrane, not by the nucleus. The nucleus is simply the gonads of the cell. It contains the genetic material. But what happens is that messengers from the environment come, they fit into the receptor, and together the messenger and the receptor then create an interaction or a reaction in the membrane that then sends a message to the nucleus, telling the nucleus what to do. In other words, the genes are turned on and off by the environment. And that's why the idea that so many of the diseases are genetic is so false, because genes are turned on and off by the environment. So we have receptors for opiates. But why do we have receptors for opiates? Why do we have receptors for a product that comes from a plant in Asia? We have receptors for them because, well, we don't actually. We don't have receptors for opiates from a plant that comes from Asia. We have receptors for opiates that our own body manufactures. In other words, our own body makes the very same substances, or very similar enough that they look alike, so that the receptors are fooled. Now, why do we have an opiate system? And by the way, our opiates are called endorphins. Endorphin means endogenous morphine-like substance. Now, why do we have opiates? Receptors. Because they play an important function in human life. In fact, they play 3 important functions. Many important functions, actually. But in the brain, the 3 major functions are, number 1, pain relief. Number 2, the experience of pleasure and reward, So without opiates, we have no sense of reward. Whenever you're happy, joyful, elated, it's because you have endorphin flow, opiate flow in your brain. And number three, they play a function, they play a role without which life is not even possible. And that role is, in a word, love, attachment. Remember, I talked about the importance of the attachment relationship, without which life is impossible. Well, it's the opiates that saliently make love possible. Whenever there's an attached, attuned interaction between a baby and a parent, they have both endorphins flowing in their brain. That's why parents get addicted to their kids, because they love that endorphin flow. In infant mice, when you knock out their opiate receptors, endorphin receptors genetically, these little mice will not vocalize distress. They will not cry for their mothers on separation. What would that mean in the wild? Their demise, obviously, because only the presence of the mother sustains the life of the infant. In other words, the opiate addiction takes hold in a brain circuit without which life is impossible. You want to know why people have such a hard time giving it up? Imagine in your life, if you had no sense of pain relief, you had too much pain, if there was little sense of reward and joy, and furthermore, not much of a sense of connection. And all of a sudden, you had this chemical that would give you all these qualities. Now, how would you give it up? Would it be sufficient for somebody to put a sign on the wall saying, just say no? Just say no to love and connection and pain relief. One sex trade worker, a 27-year-old woman, told me, the first time I did heroin, she said, it felt like a warm, soft hug. And others have told me the same thing. So that's the opiates. I've already mentioned the stimulants. In another mouse experiment in a laboratory, you take a pellet of food and you put it in the mouth of this little mouse who will chew it and swallow it and enjoy it. But if you put the food down inches away from his nose, he will not stir to eat it. In fact, will starve to death. He's quite capable of movement, but he won't. Why? Because genetically, they knocked out his dopamine receptors. Dopamine, that chemical which is elevated by the stimulant drugs, is our incentive motivation chemical. Dopamine flows whenever we're excited about something, motivated, when we're curious, vital, vibrant, feeling really alive, when we're seeking food, seeking a sexual partner, exploring a novel object or a novel environment. These are states of high dopamine flow. Without dopamine, we're listless, not motivated, and apathetic. So imagine then that somebody then gave you a substance that all of a sudden, you feel totally alive and life is exciting. How would somebody take that away from you? By putting a sign on the wall saying, just say no? And really, what you might have divined by now is the question that I'm asking is, who is susceptible to addiction? Because what is clearly not true is that drugs are addictive. Drugs are not addictive. Not by themselves. If drugs were addictive by themselves, we couldn't give morphine in large quantities to large numbers of people. But in fact we do, and they don't become addicts. Is alcohol addictive? Well, clearly not. Most people who drink alcohol, even repeatedly, even in relatively large quantities, don't become alcoholics. They don't become addicts. Is food addictive? Clearly not. Human beings have been eating forever without being food addicts. But to some people, it is addictive. Is a pack of cards or gambling addictive? Not to most people. But some people become hooked on it. So the question we have to ask is, what makes some people susceptible? The whole idea that drugs are addictive is total nonsense. Most people who try even crystal meth, and crystal meth is a very powerful drug. You know, sex will elevate your dopamine levels by 100%. Pretty good. Cocaine by 300%. Crystal meth by 1200%. So, one patient told me that crystal meth is like an orgasm without sex. But even then, most people who try crystal meth, the vast majority of people who try crystal meth, even repeatedly, don't become addicted to it. I'm not advocating that anybody should try it or use it. All I'm saying is that it's not true that by itself it can cause addictions. So clearly what you have to have is a susceptible individual and a potentially addictive behavior. And by the way, what is a potentially addictive behavior? What is a potentially addictive behavior? The answer is anything. Anything. My definition of addiction simply says, an addiction is any behavior that you crave, that gives you temporary relief or pleasure, that has negative consequences, and you can't give it up despite the negative consequences. Nothing about substances. It's any behavior, substance-related or not, that gives you temporary relief and pleasure, that you crave, and that you engage in despite negative consequences, and you're not able to give it up. That's what an addiction is. Clearly, you can be addicted to gambling, to internet, to shopping, to work, to sex, to sports, to the acquisition of wealth, to power, and to substances.
Rebellious and proud is mine. And so, in order to be able to remove the guilt and the unspeakable horrors and the sorrows that I had been carrying for a lifetime, I knew that it all hinged on confession.